The alien Admiral stood in the dimly lit observation room of his flagship, his many eyes fixed on the human child seated in front of the Starship simulator console. It was a small thing for a child no older than 6 or 7 years of age, but the Admiral couldn't look away from her as she focused intently on the screen before her. The simulator was nothing special, just a basic training tool used by the Terran forces to help their young ones learn how to operate their ships, yet there was something mesmerizing in the way the child's hands gripped the controls with a determination that didn't match her age. The Admiral had been watching for several minutes now, hoping to understand the child's behavior. He had seen similar simulations before, but never with such concentration, not from the species he had encountered over the long stretch of the war. The humans were strange in their approach to warfare. They didn't just fight with their bodies or weapons, they fought with their minds, with creativity, with a willingness to try the unpredictable. He had heard stories of their strange victories, how their tactics defied any logic and left entire fleets scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. But watching this child play the game, something clicked for the Admiral. It wasn't just that she was good at the game, it was the way she moved the ship, the way she seemed to anticipate the obstacles that would come at her before they even appeared. It was as if she wasn't just reacting to the simulation, she was somehow controlling it, bending it to her will. Her tiny fingers flew over the controls, and for a brief moment, the Admiral felt a twinge of unease, the kind of feeling he had long since grown accustomed to in the heat of battle, when the enemy seemed to know his every move before he even made it. The simulation was a basic one, the child's ship flying through an asteroid field, but her movements were so precise, so fluid that it was clear this was more than just a simple game for her. Each turn, each dodge, each slight adjustment to her course was executed with the kind of skill that most adult officers would envy. The Admiral narrowed his eyes, studying her every move. He had seen humans fight before in actual battles. Their ships were unpredictable. They acted almost recklessly. But this child, this little girl, she was calm, she was focused, she was in complete control of her surroundings, and that made her even more dangerous. The Admiral knew this wasn't normal even for the humans he had encountered in his long career as a military leader. This was something different. There was an intelligence in her play that he could not ignore. It was not the kind of intelligence that could be measured on a simple chart. It wasn't academic or clinical, it was instinctual. The child had no formal training, she was merely playing a game. But in that moment it became clear to the Admiral that humans were something else. They were not just fighters, they were learners, they were adapters, and in war that was the most dangerous trait of all. He felt a stir of something he had never quite experienced before in all his years as an Admiral, a growing sense of awe, mixed with an unsettling fear. The child finished another successful run in the simulation and looked up at the Admiral's observation window, smiling as if the victory meant nothing and everything. All at once the Admiral stared at her with a new understanding of the enemy he had been fighting for so long. And in that moment he knew one undeniable truth: humanity would be the most difficult challenge his people would ever face. The Admiral watched as the child's ship rocketed through the virtual cosmos, evading asteroid after asteroid. Her concentration never wavering for a moment. Each of her movements seemed to follow a rhythm, a beat that was impossible to predict, yet somehow completely precise. The ship twisted and turned as though the young girl had no fear at all. Her small hands moved over the console as if they were a natural extension of her body. Every flick of a button, every subtle adjustment to the throttle was done without hesitation, with an almost perfect fluidity that struck the Admiral as both remarkable and dangerous. He leaned in closer, his multiple eyes narrowing, as he observed the simulation's next phase. An enemy fleet had entered the scenario. Multiple ships were closing in on the child's vessel. It was supposed to be a simple exercise in evasion, but the child's ship seemed undeterred, as if she were no longer simply trying to avoid danger. She was analyzing it and finding ways to exploit it. It was subtle at first, the way she shifted her ship in ways that appeared random, but soon the Admiral began to see the pattern. The child was setting up a trap for the virtual enemies to fall into. Each move was deliberate, as if she were already thinking several steps ahead. The Admiral's antennae twitched slightly as he watched the child's reactions. Her fingers pressed down with increasing speed and precision as the enemy ships drew closer. Her aviator's shields flickered under fire, But she didn't retreat, she didn't run, she simply held her course, her ship suddenly veering to the left to avoid an incoming blast from a massive enemy warship. But at the last second, the child adjusted the course again, and the ship dodged as if guided by some unseen force. At the same time, her weapon system powered up, and before the Admiral could even blink, the child's ship launched a perfect salvo of missiles that crippled one of the enemy ships. The Admiral blinked in surprise. No one would have thought to strike back at that moment, no one except her. The enemy fleet responded quickly, trying to surround the child's ship, but the young girl didn't panic, she didn't falter, she seemed to thrive under the pressure, her tiny fingers pressing every button with a calm focus that was beyond her years. She split her ship into two different vectors, one to confuse the enemies, and the other to draw them into a coordinated strike. Her maneuver was flawless. The enemy fleet was divided, and the child struck again, taking out two of the attacking ships with rapid precision. The Admiral's mouth opened slightly in shock. For the first time in his life, he was watching a child do the unthinkable, and he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for humanity to transfer this level of adaptability to their real battles. He was struck by the enormity of it. The child wasn't just playing, she was solving puzzles on the fly, rearranging variables and factors and finding solutions that made no sense in a conventional tactical sense, yet always worked. Her level of learning was beyond anything the Admiral had witnessed before. It was as if she were born for this moment, the moment when the world demanded a strategist, a commander who could think like no one else. As the simulation neared its end, the child's ship was surrounded again, this time by a swarm of smaller but faster enemy craft. The Admiral watched as she focused harder, her eyes narrowing, as she made one last desperate move to break free. It was a trick, a final escape plan that even he couldn't predict, but somehow the child had seen it all along. The ship darted between the enemies in a dizzying pattern so fast that even the simulation's AI struggled to keep up, and just like that, with one last shot fired, the simulation ended with the child's ship emerging victorious. The screen flashed, and the girl let out a satisfied sigh as she leaned back in her seat, her mission complete, her gaze flicking up to the observation window for a brief moment before she turned away. The Admiral stood motionless for a long time, staring at the screen, replaying the entire encounter in his mind. This wasn't just a game, this was a warning. Humanity was evolving into something he could not predict, and the war they had started was only just beginning. The Admiral stood frozen in the observation room, his mind racing as the child smiled to herself, unaware of the magnitude of what she had just shown him. Her victory in the simulation was not simply a matter of skill or luck. It was a revelation. It dawned on him slowly, like a creeping shadow across the battlefield of his thoughts. What he had witnessed was far beyond any mere game. The child, with her innocent face and childish glee, had just demonstrated a level of strategic mastery that was supposed to come only after years of battle experience, years of facing the harshest of realities. Yet here she was, playing a game, and winning. The Admiral's antennae flicked nervously. He had studied countless species across the galaxy, analyzed their tactics, their combat strengths and weaknesses. His race was known for their cold, calculated approach to warfare. Precision, order, and strategy. They had been the cornerstones of their military success. But humanity, with its chaotic, often unpredictable nature, had confounded him from the start. Their tactics were erratic, illogical at times, but somehow always effective. He had thought it was just an anomaly, a fluke. But this child's play, it was no anomaly. It was a window into something far deeper, something far more dangerous. The Admiral's thoughts returned to the war, the endless battles that had been waged between his fleet and the human forces. Time and again, his fleet had suffered losses, battles they should have won, but didn't. And now, looking at this child, the pieces began to fall into place. The humans were adapting, learning, evolving with each confrontation. The victories that had seemed like random chance were not random at all. They were the result of a species capable of incredible flexibility, a species that could learn from every misstep, every loss, and turn it into a new strength. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he remembered the last few months of the war. The Terran forces had been getting stronger, faster. Their ships were more maneuverable, their tactics more unpredictable. What had started as a series of skirmishes had now escalated into something much larger, much more dangerous. And now, in this observation room, he was seeing the truth of it. Humans weren't simply learning. They were evolving at an astonishing rate, faster than his race could keep up with. He leaned closer to the viewport, his eyes fixed on the child's figure, now absorbed in another round of the simulation. She was already at it again, her hands moving expertly over the console, her face a mask of concentration. It was as if she didn't even need to think. She simply knew what to do next. Every move she made was instinctive, as if she had been born with a deep understanding of war. But how? How could a child know this? The answer, as much as it unsettled him, was simple. It wasn't the child herself, it was humanity. Humans had an innate ability to adapt, to learn and grow from their experiences in ways no other species could match. A chill ran down the Admiral's spine. It wasn't just the child he had to fear. It was the entire species. He thought back to the early days of the war when his fleet had been so confident, so sure of victory. They had underestimated the humans, dismissed them as weak and disorganized. They had thought the war would be quick and decisive. But now, staring at this young girl, he realized how wrong they had been. This was no ordinary fight. This was a battle against an opponent who learned faster, adapted quicker, and who, given time, would outsmart and outmaneuver them all. The Admiral's mind raced with calculations, possible counter-strategies, and contingencies, but they all seemed inadequate in the face of the human potential he had just witnessed. There was no defense against the rapid evolution of an enemy that didn't just fight. They learned. And as the Admiral turned away from the observation window, he knew one undeniable truth. The humans weren't just playing a game. They were preparing for war. And it was a war he might not be able to win. The Admiral's mind whirred with the implications of what he had witnessed, but as the minutes passed and the child continued to manipulate the simulator with ease, he felt a growing sense of unease. His fleet had been built on the principles of discipline, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The strategy was simple: engage with precision, eliminate the enemy swiftly, and leave no room for retaliation. It had worked for countless generations, a method perfected through wars across many systems. But humanity was something else entirely. The child's ship was now facing an entirely new set of challenges in the simulation. The scenario had shifted. She was no longer merely dodging asteroids, no longer simply escaping an enemy's grasp. Now, her ship was surrounded by an incoming assault, a massive fleet of enemy warships, closing in with the kind of force that should have been insurmountable for a lone vessel. The odds were overwhelmingly stacked against her. Even the Admiral, watching from the observation room, could feel the tension rise in his chest. This was where most would panic, where most would make reckless mistakes, falling into predictable traps. Yet the child, no more than a flicker of a figure in the cold silence of space, remained calm, her fingers moving across the controls with steady assurance. She didn't retreat. Instead, the girl's ship surged forward, breaking from the encirclement in a daring maneuver that confused the oncoming fleet. The Admiral's eyes widened in shock as he watched the child make a move no one could have anticipated. She didn't flee to the edges of the battlefield, where she could hide behind asteroids or debris. She went straight into the heart of the enemy formation, pulling them into her orbit with an almost magnetic force. Every instinct screamed that it was a fool's play. In every book on tactics he had studied, every simulation he had run, the strategy of charging directly into overwhelming odds was considered a surefire route to disaster. Yet here she was, a child, executing it flawlessly. And the strangest part, the way the simulation responded. As if it were reacting to her actions, bending itself to her will, as if her very moves were being understood by the system itself. The enemy ships closed in, firing relentlessly, but it didn't seem to matter. The child's hands danced across the controls in a way that was now almost hypnotic, her eyes locked on the tactical layout of the battle. Each shift of her ship's vector seemed calculated, deliberate. It was no longer a game, it was real-time combat, and the Admiral could see that she was seeing the whole battlefield, processing information faster than he had ever seen anyone do in his life. And then, in an instant, it happened. She split her ship into two. One portion dove deeper into the enemy's formation, pulling the fire of multiple ships toward it, while the other veered sharply away, circling around the periphery, silently picking off enemy ships one by one with well-timed strikes. The Admiral's antennae stiffened. He knew exactly what she was doing now. She had created confusion, drawn the enemy into a frenzy of disorganized fire, and now she was systematically picking them apart, using their own aggression against them. It was a classic maneuver, a brilliant one. But what struck the Admiral as impossible was how quickly she had executed it, how naturally it came to her. He stood frozen, gripped by an unsettling sense of realization. This child, this unassuming figure, had just taken him to a place he had never expected. The Terran forces didn't just fight. They adapted, learning from every engagement, refining their tactics and responding with a speed that surpassed anything he had ever encountered. It was as if every battle, every small skirmish, was a live exercise in evolution for humanity. And they were evolving fast. The simulation continued, and one by one, the enemy ships fell. The child's ship emerged victorious, as if it had been a foregone conclusion. She relaxed her grip on the console, a faint, satisfied smile crossing her face as she leaned back in her seat, oblivious to the storm of thoughts whirling in the Admiral's mind. In that moment, the Admiral realized the true horror of humanity's potential. They weren't just a species that fought. They were a species that could learn, adapt, and conquer at an astonishing pace. And as the child turned to glance once more at the observation window, the Admiral knew that no matter how many ships he commanded, no matter how many strategies he devised, it would never be enough. Humanity had already surpassed them. The war was no longer about victory. It was about survival. And in that moment, he wondered if his fleet could survive long enough to face the full weight of humanity's relentless evolution. The Admiral stepped back from the observation window, his mind swirling in a haze of disbelief and dawning fear. The child, having finished her simulated victory, was now absent-mindedly adjusting the settings for another round, her small hands moving swiftly, effortlessly. It was as if she hadn't just conquered an entire fleet in a virtual battle, like it had been a simple exercise in practice, a test she had passed with no more difficulty than tying her shoes. But for the Admiral, it was more than that. It was a revelation, one that shook the foundations of everything he had ever believed about warfare, about strategy, about the future of this war. He turned away, his thoughts a torrent of confusion and dread. The Terran fleet had always been a thorn in his side, but now, after seeing this child's instinctual brilliance, the situation felt different. The humans weren't just unpredictable, they were evolving, rapidly. What had once been seen as chaotic disarray now appeared to be a kind of natural progression, a living, breathing system that adapted with every move. The Admiral had thought his fleet was prepared for anything, that their power and experience could crush the humans in time. But the child had shown him a truth that he could no longer ignore. The humans were learning faster than his fleet could react. The implications of this were terrifying. If a child, barely old enough to understand the horrors of war, could possess such natural tactical genius, what would the humans be like in 5 years? 10. The Admiral felt a cold sweat creeping along his skin as he realized that the Terran race might already be far beyond his ability to predict, let alone defeat. The war had not been just about numbers, ships, or firepower. It had been about adaptability. And humanity was winning the race. He paced across the room, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of helplessness. He had seen his fleet defeat countless others. His species had been built for war, honed in the crucible of conflict for millennia. Their strategies were flawless, their tactics calculated to perfection. But the humans, humanity's greatest strength wasn't their firepower or their technology, it was their minds. Their ability to learn and adapt, to break free from the constraints of tradition, and find new ways to fight. The Admiral had been watching the evolution of a species in real time, and it terrified him more than any weapon or army ever could. The child's soft laughter drifted across the room as she set up yet another simulation, readying herself for a new challenge. The Admiral could see that her mind was already shifting gears, already analyzing new scenarios, new ways to test her skills. There was no end to it. She wasn't just playing a game. She was becoming something more. And in her small, innocent way, she was preparing for war. The Admiral returned to the viewport, his thoughts racing. How many more children like her were there? How many more humans were out there, quietly refining their tactical genius in ways the galaxy had never seen before? He had seen human commanders before, of course, but those were adults, seasoned veterans. The child's skills, her natural brilliance, her ability to adapt and outthink her opponents. It was a glimpse into what humanity could become if given enough time. And it was a terrifying thought. For the first time in his career, the Admiral felt a deep sense of uncertainty. His species, with all its power, its might, and its history of military dominance, had always assumed that victory was a matter of time, of sheer strength and experience. But this child represented something new, something dangerous. She was a part of something much bigger, a species that had the potential to evolve faster than any enemy he had ever faced. The humans weren't just learning. They were becoming something else, something unstoppable. As the Admiral turned to leave the observation room, his mind remained heavy with the weight of what he had seen. The war was no longer about who had the superior technology or the stronger fleet. It was about survival against an enemy that was already on the path to surpassing them. And in that moment, the Admiral realized the truth. Humanity wasn't just the underdog anymore. They were the apex predators, and he had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare. The Admiral's mind buzzed as he retreated to his personal command quarters, the dim lights casting long shadows across the metallic walls. His thoughts couldn't settle, constantly circling back to the same chilling realization. Humanity was evolving faster than his fleet could adapt, and what was once a war he felt confident about had now become an existential struggle for survival. He had seen the reports, studied the battlefield data, but it wasn't until he had witnessed the child that the true nature of the human advantage became clear. He ran his claws through the data from the latest engagement, a skirmish between his fleet and a Terran task force. The humans had outmaneuvered them again, their forces scattering like ghosts in the night, making precise strikes before disappearing into the void. The patterns were no longer random. They were organized, methodical. Each victory seemed like a fluke at first, but now the Admiral understood. They were learning. The Terrans were learning faster than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just their ability to adapt that worried him. It was the way they absorbed everything around them, like a sponge soaking up the world's challenges and turning them into strengths. The child's behavior on the simulator was the ultimate proof. She wasn't simply playing a game. She was actively rewriting the rules, bending them to her will. The ship she controlled was no longer just a digital avatar. It was an extension of her mind, an instrument of war, instinctively attuned to the world around it. The Admiral sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the stars beyond the viewing port. He had always thought of his species as being the pinnacle of military strategy. His fleet was a well-oiled machine, operating on the principles of cold efficiency. But now he was seeing humanity's greatest weapon, adaptability. His race had always believed in the supremacy of logic and order. But humans? They thrived on chaos, on unpredictability. And it was this chaotic adaptability that made them so dangerous. A sudden chime broke the Admiral's thoughts. It was an incoming communication from his top strategist, Commander Zir. The message was marked urgent, and the Admiral's eyes narrowed as he activated the holoscreen. "Admiral, I bring troubling news. Zir's voice crackled through the static. Our latest attempt to engage a Terran fleet has ended in failure once again. We followed all the expected protocols, but once again, the humans have adapted, adjusting their tactics, splitting their forces in a way we couldn't predict. Our countermeasures were ineffective. The Admiral leaned forward, his claws tapping anxiously on the table. What is it that we're missing, Commander? Why are we still losing? Zir hesitated before replying, clearly choosing his words carefully. It's their ability to learn, sir. Every time we strike, every engagement, they take notes, adapt, and counter. It's as if they're evolving mid-battle. We're fighting a moving target, constantly shifting and changing. The Admiral's eyes widened as the full weight of Zir's words hit him. Evolving, mid-battle. He echoed softly, almost to himself. Yes, Zir continued. It's almost as though their strategy is living, breathing, constantly in flux. We can no longer anticipate their next move. They're not just using technology or tactics. They are using instinct, and that makes them unpredictable in a way we've never faced. The Admiral's mind churned. This wasn't just about better technology, better ships, or better tactics anymore. The Terrans had found a way to make war itself adaptive, fluid, alive. Their greatest weapon wasn't the firepower of their ships or the strength of their fleets. It was their minds, constantly evolving and outthinking their opponents. We need to rethink everything, the Admiral muttered, the enormity of the situation sinking in. We can't keep fighting them like we have been. It's no longer just about strength in numbers. It's about anticipating the unanticipated. Zir was silent for a moment. Admiral, it's worse than that. Our intelligence reports show that human commanders are using simulations like the one you observed earlier to train their youth. It's not just one child. It's entire generations of them, preparing for war in ways we can't comprehend. They're teaching their young to adapt at a level that outpaces our best officers. The Admiral's breath caught in his chest. Entire generations. What he had seen in that child was no isolated case. This was the future of humanity, a future where every child was being groomed for war, not through traditional military training, but through the development of a new kind of warfare, one that was less about brute force and more about evolution, about learning and growing with every engagement. The Admiral clenched his fists. If humanity could adapt so swiftly, how could his fleet possibly keep up? The war had changed. It was no longer just a matter of defeating an enemy. It was a race to survive against a species that could outlearn them at every turn. And in that moment, the Admiral realized with a sickening certainty that the only way forward was to change the nature of the fight itself. **7**. The Admiral stood before the War Council, his usual confidence replaced by a cold, unsettling resolve. His fleet's tactics had always relied on meticulous planning and overwhelming force, but now he understood that this was no longer enough. Humanity had shown him the harsh truth. No amount of strength or precision would defeat them. The war had shifted into a different kind of battle, one of intellect, adaptability, and unpredictable evolution. The humans were not just fighting. They were innovating, learning from every mistake, and rewriting the rules of engagement as they went along. The council chamber was eerily silent, the high-ranking officers of the Admiral's fleet sitting in their seats, watching him with expectant eyes. They had seen the same reports, the same failures. They had all come to the same conclusion. Humanity was becoming something they couldn't fight conventionally. The Admiral's voice broke the silence, low but sharp, as he addressed his officers. "The Terrans have shown us what they are capable of," he said, his tone grim. "We've underestimated them for too long. We believed that war could be fought with numbers, with superior firepower. But humanity is different. They have something we do not." One of the senior commanders, Commander Sauer, spoke up. "Their adaptability, sir. We saw it in their fleets, in the way they constantly change and adjust. They don't fight like any enemy we faced before." The Admiral nodded, his mind still reeling from the revelation. "Exactly. Their strategy isn't based on overwhelming strength, but on fluidity. They adjust in real time, learning and evolving faster than we can respond. We can no longer rely on our usual tactics. We need to do something that humanity cannot anticipate. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. It was a rare thing for the Admiral to speak so openly of fear, but there was no denying it. The Terrans were no longer just a threat. They were an enigma, a force capable of defying all logic and strategy. "We've been fighting the wrong war," the Admiral continued, his voice growing more intense. "We must learn to think like them, to understand their evolution, not just their military tactics. The humans are not just learning from each engagement. They are developing new ways to think, to act. Their next move will never be what we expect, and we must be ready for that." There was a long pause as the council digested his words. Finally, Commander Jarek, a young officer known for his quick thinking, spoke. "Are we suggesting we need to train our fleet to adapt in the same way they do? To fight without patterns, to constantly change tactics mid-battle?" He asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "How do we even begin to prepare for that?" The Admiral's gaze hardened. "That is exactly what I am suggesting. We must train our officers and soldiers to think beyond their training, beyond their conditioning. They must learn to act in ways that don't rely on predictable patterns. We must embrace chaos in a controlled manner." Zaller's eyes narrowed. "Chaos? That sounds like madness. We can't just throw away everything we've built." "We're not throwing it away," the Admiral replied sharply. "We're adapting. And we will have to be willing to risk everything to do it. The humans don't need to be defeated in the way we've always thought. They need to be outpaced, outsmarted. They've taken war into their hands, and now we must do the same." There was another long silence, broken only by the hum of the ship's systems. The officers were clearly unsettled, but the Admiral could see the realization dawning on them. They had been fighting the war as they always had, but it was no longer the same war. Humanity had changed the very nature of conflict. And now, they had no choice but to change with it. "We will begin a new phase of training," the Admiral declared. "We will teach our soldiers to think without patterns. We will create new methods of warfare, ones that can evolve just as quickly as the humans do. Our strength will not lie in numbers, but in our ability to outthink and outmaneuver them. We may not be able to defeat them in the traditional sense, but we can make them question everything they believe about war." As the officers nodded reluctantly, the Admiral allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous even, but he knew one thing with certainty. Humanity was not the only species capable of evolving. His fleet would adapt. They would learn. And if they could do that, they might just have a chance. But as he left the council chamber, a lingering thought gnawed at the Admiral. In his heart, he couldn't shake the fear that even as they prepared to adapt, the humans might already be one step ahead. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. Weeks passed, and the Admiral threw himself into the new directive with a determination he had never known. The war had taken a turn, and every command, every decision now carried the weight of a new reality. His fleet, once the epitome of precision and control, was undergoing a transformation. They were training soldiers to think without patterns, to break free from the old frameworks that had made them so effective in the past. Chaos, controlled chaos, had become their guiding principle. The first few exercises were disastrous. His officers, seasoned veterans of countless battles, were caught off guard by the new methods. Their instincts, honed over decades of warfare, seemed to fail them when they were forced to act without the comforting crutch of logic and order. Even the younger officers, trained in the latest tactics, struggled to adjust. The Admiral watched in frustration as they floundered, the familiar precision of his fleet slipping through his fingers like sand. But he pressed on, determined to forge a new path. One night, as the fleet was midway through another round of simulations, the Admiral found himself standing before the observation window once again. The room was dark, save for the glowing holoscreens that illuminated the faces of his officers. The simulation was running smoothly, a test of the new tactics they had developed. But there was something in the air, something that felt different. The familiar sense of dread crept up his spine as the fleet's ships maneuvered against an enemy force that resembled the human tactics they had witnessed so many times before. The human fleet's movements were erratic, unpredictable, yet somehow they always found a way to counter. And then the Admiral's breath caught in his throat. For the first time, his fleet was doing it. The officers were adapting, thinking without relying on their training, adjusting on the fly, reacting to each unpredictable move of the enemy force. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still mistakes, still moments of hesitation. But the core of the strategy was there. His officers were no longer reacting like machines. They were beginning to think like humans, able to pivot and evolve in real time, just like the Terrans had done. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he watched his fleet start to turn the tide. Ships that had once been predictable and rigid now danced through space in ways that were almost instinctual. Their formations weren't fixed. They split, regrouped, darted in unexpected directions, creating confusion in the enemy ranks. The human tactics, chaotic as they seemed, now seemed strangely familiar to the Admiral. It was as if he were watching his fleet become the thing they had once feared. They were learning. They were evolving. As the simulation ended, the Admiral turned to face his officers. The room was filled with a tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. The look on their faces was one of quiet disbelief. They had done it. They had adapted. "Not bad," the Admiral said, his voice low but steady. "We've made progress, but we're not finished yet." Commander Saller, who had been the most vocal in his doubts about the new training methods, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and caution. "Admiral, this is incredible. We've actually done it. We're thinking like them." The Admiral's gaze hardened. "Yes, but don't mistake progress for victory. We've learned to fight like them, to think like them. But the Terrans are still ahead. They have the advantage of time. Time to refine their tactics, to keep evolving. We have to outpace them, outthink them faster than they can adapt. They may have evolved into something unpredictable, but now we must become the apex predators in this war." There was a murmur of agreement from the officers, but the Admiral could see the flickers of doubt in their eyes. They had trained, they had adapted, but could they truly outpace humanity? Could they evolve faster than the Terrans, who had already demonstrated such a remarkable capacity for learning? The Admiral knew the answer wasn't simple. The humans had proven they could learn, grow, and adapt at an alarming rate. But now his fleet had a chance to meet them on equal ground. Humanity had once been seen as the underdog, a chaotic, unpredictable force. But now, the Admiral realized it was his fleet that was in danger of becoming the prey. And as he gazed out into the endless expanse of space, the realization sank in deep. The war was no longer about firepower or numbers. It was about who could learn the fastest, who could adapt without hesitation. And the Admiral knew that if his fleet couldn't continue to evolve, if they couldn't stay one step ahead, they would be swallowed by the very thing they had once underestimated: humanity's relentless, unstoppable will to survive. And in that moment, as the stars stretched out before him, the Admiral understood one final, horrifying truth: the humans had already won. The war was not about defeating them. It was about keeping up. And that, in itself, was a battle he might never be able to win.